So I'm Chris Miele. I'm a historian by first profession, but I'm a chartered town planner. I'm a partner in a firm of development surveyors. What that means is we advise developers on all aspects of property, from the economics right the way through to achieving planning consent. And we work for a range of people, so all the blue chip commercial and residential developers, as well as arts organizations and universities, big and small. I thought this is a provocative slide. This is one of the strategic views in London from the General Wolfe statue. This is Canary Wharf. Would you believe me if I told you that the yellow line is what's been consented? And this is my project for Canary Wharf Group on Wood Wharf. That's being built at the moment. Orange is what's in the pipeline. So there's an enormous change going on in London. Let me see. All right. So what I'm going to look at today briefly, the 5 topics that I've asked you to look at, is use of the senses. I'm going to look a bit at methods, because we do actually have quite a structure for the way we do our work. What I do is I work as a planner on major regeneration projects. I specialize actually in this topic area we're looking at. I do some other things too, but it's one of my special areas, what's called Heritage Townscape and Visual Impact Assessment. We use that work to shape developments, and some examples of the things that we have at the office at the moment. Very large retail and residential regeneration scheme in Wandsworth. I got consent for the 2 tallest residential towers in central London, that pair there, where we used visual impact assessment to guide the height of the towers. Actually, we originally started out with a really tall one here, and we flipped it because of some view impacts along from Parliament Square, which is rather troubling. And I do a lot of work for arts organizations. British Museum, I've advised for many years, and the South Bank Centre, funnily enough. We were going to get rid of the skateboarders, but we provide their accommodation, which people fail to appreciate. Why do we have to do this work? Because obviously there's a lot of money running in London at the moment, and not just London, all over the country now. And the government wants us to promote economic development through the planning system. At the national level there's policy, and at the regional level there's policy too, which is the London Plan. And the planning system is there to guide economic development so that it delivers public goods. That's the basic balance that has to be struck. So both interests should be served. The senses that we use in my line of work are probably principally visual, and I'll talk about that, audio to a certain extent, and certain town planners who work on power stations, for example, use smell, and there are some people who, as planners, have kind of registered sensitivities of smells, which is sort of interesting. We also do consider the perception of areas through public consultation, through the analysis of the uses in an area, the intensity of uses and the amounts of uses. We carry out research to try to understand why people are moving in particular directions and what they're attending to when they move. So what are the methods that we use? Well, actually, as a professional in this area, I worked to this document, the Guidelines for Landscape and Visual Impact Assessment, 3rd edition, which is the industry standard for this area of work. And there's other things that we work to, which are very structured. When we're working in the setting of World Heritage Sites, there's mayoral guidance on the way you assess setting impacts. And there's a London View Management Framework, which deals with the 27 strategic views in London. I was the principal author of the 1st edition of this for the mayor back in 2007. Some of the views we regulate in London are absolutely geometrically regulated. There are a number of views of the palaces of Westminster and St. Paul's Cathedral. And if you get up high in London, you see there's low buildings in certain areas. Those will be the red ones. You can't build anything there. So a lot of people don't know that London's skyline is really very carefully planned and shaped. The tools that we use in terms of visual impact assessment are site survey. We have a lot of digital technology that we rely on. We do use what's called accurate visual representation, although I think the shots Ewan was showing are more computer-generated images prepared by architects to sell the scheme. But I'm not talking about that kind of visual impact. And then we use various things to establish just how wide a visual impact is going to be. So we call those zones of visual influence, and particularly for building a tall building, you want to know over what area it will affect perceptions. For our site survey work, we have a structured method, a 4-page data gathering sheet. I have some copies here if you want to take them away, which is best on, I've sort of devised it over the last 15 years where I've been working in this practice. You go out, you do the survey sheets. Well, I don't anymore, unfortunately, my staff do usually. And we also use what are called city models. So many of the specialist visualization companies have 3-dimensional computer models of the whole of central London. They're reasonably accurate. They're based on Z mapping information, which has been enhanced by topographical information. And we do things like, on a redevelopment I can't name particularly at the moment because it's live, looking at an existing site in Islington, we want to build the building taller. The architect's model is put into the computer model, and we're able to move around the virtual model and see exactly what the extent of impact is going to be. We do use accurate visual representations. This building doesn't exist, but I helped get consent for Elizabeth House on the South Bank, which is about 1 million square feet overall of mixed residential and commercial development by David Chipperfield Architects. Interestingly, the company that did this image, Miller Hare, who's an industry leader, do go back and photograph the buildings that they rendered at exactly the same time of year and day, and you can't tell them apart. That doesn't mean the images are accurate, because of course two-dimensional images don't reproduce visual perception, which is an intellectual thing, but it gives you an accurate understanding of color, tonality, position, scale, location. So they are accurate, and they're also independent, which is to say that the same company coming along with the same information would get the same result, and that works. We also do a thing called zone of visual influence. It comes from landscape planning for large infrastructure projects, where you basically, in the computer model, put a light on the development and shine it back into the area to figure out where you actually are going to be seen. This image is interesting. What's in black, it's been completed now, a tower site here where our client had consent for a 22-story building and he went back for 28. And so what we plotted was where the 22 could be seen, which is the black, and then the additional 6 stories is the additional impact in red. And that's to help calibrate the additional impact of the development. On really big schemes, this is the one I was showing earlier at Vauxhall 9 Elms, we do very elaborate visual impact assessments over as many as 2 kilometers because of the scale of the development. We identify views on the basis of site surveys. We agree these with the GLA and with the local authority, and then they're modeled in differing forms. And this is, you won't expect to read it, but on another project, a number of views that we've identified. We relate them to the particular character area that the view is made from, whether or not there's any heritage receptors, as they're called. Unfortunately, the terminology is a little silly. Visual receptors, which would be people using public open space, stopping at the bus stop, shopping, living, and the nature of the view. And then on the basis of that, we determine what kind of render. Is it a full render? Is it a wireline? The kind I showed you. Now these methods, and EIA is a technical process in UK law from the 2012 environmental regulations from the European Union. These really big schemes have kind of multiple assessments done of environmental impacts. This method of assessment relies on quantifiable information, and that information I'm talking about is visual information, but wind, overshadowing, telecommunications interference, transport. So all those topic areas are considered. But it also, when you're dealing with this area, you have to rely on qualitative assessments, because you can't get away from that. When you do ES work, there's a matrix for assessment, which is incredibly rigid. You put in the nature of the receptor on the top, from low to kind of high. High would be a World Heritage Site in the case of Heritage, for example. And then you see whether or not there's an impact, and you read across the scale, and you get an impact. And it's a really crude way to do it, but this is something we do just as a first pass to identify where we're throwing up any negatives that require further assessment or mitigation, so changes to design, because this process is intended to and does influence the shape of design. When we use or apply qualitative assessment, we ask ourselves a series of questions, generally. In relation to visual matters, how is a scene composed? What is its nature? What is its foreground, its middle ground, its background? What are the activities? Is it a noisy place? Is it a quiet place? When you're in a street scene, is the view focused in an obvious direction? How long is the view? What is the duration? If you walk along the mall, for example, the view is very long that you get because there's one object in focus. It's a plan view. And then there's a thing that there's a lot of research being done on this actually, natural attentiveness. So if you follow the way the eye moves in any urban scene, you realize it actually only goes to about 7 meters normally. And eyes, as human beings, we tend to focus on faces. There is actually digital research being done on tracking the optical movements in the street scene. And I think it's something you should probably look at. So for example, when you come to a site like Somerset House, there's a lot of debate about the impact of tall buildings from various parts of the courtyard. You come into it, it's a very enclosed scene, a well-defined scene, a uniform scene with a particular cultural focus, and therefore a scene that is very susceptible to visual impact and harmed as a result. Another strategic view from the Blue Bridge in St. James's Park, where people tend to look and contemplate both historic London and also parts of modern London. And there's good evidence from photographic sharing sites like Google or Flickr that people actually like the juxtaposition of old and new in London. London is, as it happens, the most photographed city in the world. There are people at Cornell University doing research on viewpoint popularity. Again, you should, I think, get in touch with them. And the most popular image in London is Big Ben with the eye. It's not St. Paul's. And the Gherkin comes next, and then St. Paul's. Tower of London is fourth, and people like photographing it from Tower Bridge with modern tall buildings behind it. We also, so we take into account, do you stop and linger? Do you move through a scene? What are you doing when you're experiencing something visually? Are you sitting and enjoying picnics, for example? What's the effect of seasons on a view? Because obviously when leaves fall from the trees, there's more visibility. And critically, daytime and nighttime effects. And above all else, distance, because something you see over 2 kilometers really isn't present in your consciousness in comparison to something you see over 20 meters, for example. And of course, uses. And part of when we work in areas, obviously, there's, as a planner, all planning policy requires you in certain areas to complement or reinforce uses which are identified in the local plan. So in a way, we have to do that, and the planning system's already taken that into account. But we do try to take into account the particular nature of uses and what you focus on when you're in those spaces. We make adjustments, so in this process, when we find any harmful effect, we try to mitigate it, either through design or through some compensatory measure. It might be screen planting. And the sort of adjustments we apply to designs, changes to position, scale, form, use of materials, the appearance of something, landscaping and lighting. So all these factors then, from the assessment process, get woven into the design. Now, in terms of understanding, we have obviously to apply professional judgment to these matters. The material we produce is subject to public consultation, and as I said earlier, we do consult the public as part of any kind of major planning scheme. And it's very interesting what people are, it actually is another area you should look at, because what people focus on is surprisingly narrow. It almost always comes down to crossing, transport, bins, and whether or not the local shop on the corner is going to be lost. It is actually quite interesting what people are, when you turn up at a public exhibition to show them about a development. So all of these things are things that we do in terms of understanding. One of the things I haven't talked about is we do look at viewpoint preferences. So we do research to understand how photographed certain views are and whether or not to photograph the historical sources. We talk to the public. We do use questionnaires in some cases, but I should say that in planning there's no legal requirement to consult the public at all. You have to be careful when you consult the public because most people who turn up are not representative. They tend to be people who have a particular interest, but we do take down the postcodes if people turn up, so we're able to produce a consultation map which shows where certain people have come from. Of course, objectors will often use all kinds of campaigning, which tends not to have much weight in the planning process, because obviously planning is a legal process determined by merits. And we do, and actually my first profession really is as a historic buildings expert, and I haven't really talked much about that. It's its own specialism. Perhaps to a greater degree than visual impact assessment, we rely on intellectual understanding of the place, which will be associations and knowledge based on historical understanding, which won't be evident. So there's a kind of invisible association we have to take into account when we're working, as I was for many years, for the Architectural Association on a master plan for their site in Bedford Square. This is a photograph made from the front door. And indeed, the historic environment has its own complexities which interact with planning policy. So by way of conclusion, I'll say that the things that you're interested in are actually being taken into account by professionals. They're being reviewed, they're being published, there are set standards and qualitative criteria. But what we probably don't attend to, and maybe can't, because there's a limit to what we can do in our sector, are things like memories or personal feelings, are things that we don't. I'm not sure, as a planner, how I would give any weight to those particular points of view, because the planning system is a legal process, there's a statutory development plan, it's consulted, it needs to do certain things. But I have to say, certainly in all the projects I'm involved with, that through public consultation, if we learn about things, we want to try to incorporate what people say, because obviously we want our planning applications to go through with the least possible objection. So there's no disincentive, or rather there's no incentive to disregard some of those attachments. If they can be accommodated, certainly there's willing to accommodate them. Certainly when we're talking about the kinds of projects we're involved with, which are, I have to say, very high value projects, where actually the developers tend to be quite smart and sophisticated, and will respond if it's a question of getting an easy ride or not. The professionals are rather more interested in the quality of the development, perhaps, but then that adds to value too. So that's the question, I suppose. I think we do, but I would say that as a professional working in it. So thanks.